Level up your Excel skills in our 7th training series. Join us to master the art of drop-down lists, a game changer in spreadsheet proficiency. Impress your colleagues with efficient data input and manipulation. Elevate your Excel game and enhance collaboration. Let's dive into the magic.
Today's video is more than just the basics of Excel's data validation. I'm going to show you how you can get the content of the dropdown to be dynamic. So if you add new categories, they automatically show in the dropdown. Then I'm going to show you how you can validate for specific entries. For example, let's say the input date should fall in the future, or numbers input should fall within a range, or the input value should contain a specific number of characters. Imagine this. Imagine you work for the headquarters of a company that creates different types of apps, and you have 3 divisions. You have the game, productivity, and utility divisions. Now, you're responsible for collecting the information on the different types of projects that each company is working on. You've created this template that includes the basic information you need to collect from them. In the first column, you have division, and you need to make sure that they type in the correct division, that they don't make any spelling mistakes, because some people could spell games instead of the game division, right? And you don't want to spend a lot of your time correcting these mistakes. So here you want to add a drop-down list where the people can actually select the divisions. For this, you can add a data validation. To do that, you have to go to the Data tab, and underneath Data Tools, you see something called Data Validation. Just click on it. The first tab here is the Settings tab, and you can see that by default, Excel allows you to input any value in any of these cells, but you can change that. You could add in additional restrictions. Now you can see we have different options here. You can also get very creative by adding in a custom check here using formulas. But in this specific case, we want to add a list. This means we're adding our own dropdown. Now under source, we have different options. We could use cell referencing to keep things dynamic, or we could input something directly in here. So let's say these divisions are super static and they're hardly ever going to change. I could actually type in game, productivity, and utility here, and I just have to use my usual Excel separator between these. Okay, and I'm just going to go with OK, and I get this little down arrow here. When I click it, I can choose between the 3 different types of divisions. Now, if these divisions were likely going to change, so let's say it could be that I rename the game division to the games division, it's better to use dynamic cell references and have these divisions somewhere in Excel cells. Now, in this case, I've added them to my Master Data tab, and I've typed in the name of the division right here. So now, instead of fixing them, I'm going to use cell references. So let's go back to data validation, and for source, I'm just going to say equals, and let's go to master and highlight this area and say OK. And now I have my 3 different divisions. So if I change the name of the game division to the games division, it will automatically reflect in here. What happens if I add in another division to this? Is my list going to update automatically? So let's say I'm going to add in the health division on the bottom here. I'm going to go back, click on this. It's not included, right? Because my list was restricted to that range that we saw here. So to include it, I need to update this range. But there are ways around this where you don't need to update this range. I'm going to show you 2 different ways here. One is that when you add something to this list, not to add it on the bottom here, but to add it somewhere in the middle. So let's say I'm just going to insert a row in here and then push health in between. Now if I go back, I can see health shows up here. Now you can also do that by using the shift key and bringing something up. So let's say I'm going to add a new one here. Now it's not going to show up on this list yet. If I go back here and I use the Shift key and then I bring it up here, it basically inserts a row before this. So when I go back here, I can see that new has been added to the list. Okay, so that's one approach, but that's something that you have to remember to do every time you add in a new division. And let's say this is something that is going to update quite often, and you don't always want to think about doing this. You just want to add something to the bottom of this list, and you want your data validation to update automatically. To do that, you can turn this into an official Excel table. All you have to do is to click somewhere inside this data set and then press Ctrl T. We get this pop-up where it asks, does your table have headers? In this case, it's recognized that I have a header, so I'm just going to go with OK. Now, automatically, Excel assigns a table style here. I'm just going to go and clear that table style. Right here under Table Tools, Excel has also given this a default table name. So in this case, it's called Table 1. So I'm just going to update that name and call this Table Div and press Enter. Now, the advantage of Excel tables is that your ranges generally update automatically. So now if I make a formula, I just say this equals, and I'm going to highlight this area. You can see that Excel uses this type of table referencing. Table div is the name of my table, and division is the name of the header, and it's putting it in square brackets. And that's the type of referencing that I want to use in my data validation. So I'm just going to copy this, press Escape to leave, and go back to my data validation here. For source here, I want to use that table referencing. So I'm just going to say equals, and I'm going to paste that in. Now here's the problem. Data validation doesn't like the table referencing style directly in here. The way around it is to use the indirect function. I have a separate video that explains how indirect works, and I'm going to put the link to that in the description of this video. Basically, what it does is that it turns a text into an address. So I'm going to give the indirect function this reference as text. All it does is that it translates it into a range reference. And I'm going to say, OK. Now I can get the data validation to work. And now the great thing is if I add something below this, so let's say I add in my health division, I don't have to worry about bringing it in the middle of this data set. I can see that my table here expanded automatically. And if I go back here and I click on this dropdown, I automatically see health in here. There is also another way around this, and that's to use the name manager. So instead of using the indirect function, you can give that table reference a name inside name manager and use that name inside the data validation. The indirect function just helps avoid this one extra step. Now let's improve on this a little bit. Let's add in some text here so that the user knows what they should be doing in here. Under data validation, we have some options to add in an input message and an error alert message. Select division, and the input message is, please make a selection from the list. Under error alert, you can define a custom message. In the first step, let's just not define a custom message. Let's just go with OK. We can see select div, please make a selection from the list. If they don't make a selection and they just type in prod here, they get this default Excel error alert message. And it says this value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for this cell. So you could either just go ahead with that one, or you can customize it by putting in your error message in here. And say, okay, so you don't necessarily need to add in a title. So I'm just going to go with prod. Now I see please select from the list. Okay, so that takes care of the division. Now let's just take a quick look at the other options that we have under data validation. Let's say that for project start date, we've added a comment here that says date must be larger than today's date. So whenever they open this spreadsheet and they want to input, they need to pick a future date. And we don't want to rely on the people reading this comment because from experience, we've seen that they don't read these comments, so we just want to make sure that we add in checks inside the cells. We're going to go back to data validation. We're going to go back to settings, make another selection here. In this case, it doesn't really make sense to add a list because it could be any date that's bigger than today's date. So which one do you think we can go with? Let's go with the date option here. We can choose that the date is between two different dates. So let's say we want the date to be in 2018. We could make sure that the start date is the 1st of 2018 and the end date is the last date in 2018. But in this case, we just want to make sure that it's greater than today's date. So our start date is going to be dependent on the date of today. And for that, we can use the today formula. You just have to open and close the bracket because it's a function. Here we can add in an input message. Please input project start date. And under error alert, make sure it's a future date. And say OK. So please input project start date. Now, if I input a date from the past, let's do 7/7/2017, say make sure it's a future date. So I'm going to retry, change that to 2018, and it works. Next is the project number. So we want to make sure that the project number is 4 digits and that those 4 digits are between 1000 to 2000. Let's just say that these are the project numbers that our company has decided to assign to the projects that we're doing in the current year. Let's go back to data validation. Under settings, which one do you think we can go with? Let's check whole number. We can go with between and we can define a minimum and maximum. And the minimum was 1000 and the maximum was 2000. And I'm going to mention that under error alert. Okay, so if I input 1000, it's fine. If I input this, it's not okay. Next one is company code. So the code must be 5 characters. I want to make sure here that the people don't input the name of the company, but the code of the company. I could give them a list to choose from, or I could just do a basic check that the code that they enter is 5 characters long, because that's how we have defined the codes in the company. So I can go back to data validation here, go back to settings, and which one do you think I can pick for this? Text length. I can make sure that the text length is equal to 5 and say OK. Okay, so it must be 5 characters. So I would say S, let's say 2010. That's okay, but if I do SE 2010, it's not okay. Now, what you can do is to take it a step further, you could also make sure that the first character is the text and the remaining characters are numbers. And that's when you can use the custom function and use formulas for this. You could even take this a step further and make sure that the first 2 or 3 characters are text, followed by a number in between, followed by text in the end, right? As long as there's some logic, you can program that inside the custom function. I'm not going to show it in this lecture because that's a more advanced topic that needs to be addressed separately. So if you're interested to find out how that could be done, just make a comment underneath the video. Last is for project description. Here I could just let them input any value, but just to make sure that they do elaborate a little bit on this project, I'm going to make sure that the text that they input here is at least greater than, let's say, 20 characters, and say OK. So if I just say it will be amazing, I get an error because it's for our health, then this is accepted. Now, of course, for that, you can also add in an error alert so that the people know why you're not accepting their input. So now we've created all these data validations for the first line, but they're not applicable to the next lines. To copy and paste the data validations here, all we have to do is to highlight this area, press Ctrl C, then just go down until where you think that people are going to input. So let's go to here, and I'm going to highlight this, right mouse click, go to Paste Special, and click on Validation, because we only want to copy and paste the validations and not the contents of this. Okay, so now we can see them everywhere. So if I go back to validation here, we can see that my validation is in place.